Good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome to our latest knowledge burst round. Today, we're going to talk about edge intelligence and this whole emergent world of all these really cool kind of tests and devices that are beginning to come to market in terms of this next generation and helping us understand more about ourselves. And what we talked about in previous knowledge verse, we talked about this whole power moving out to the edge in terms of network capacity, processing power, be it at the enterprise level in terms of how enterprises and providers are implementing hybrid cloud type solutions, but also the power that we carry around in our pocket each and every day, that cell phone, and how that's becoming our own individual data hub. You know, one of the premises that we've always had at BurstIQ that we're going to see a tipping point event where we'll see the convergence of data, and I do believe we are in the age of data abundance and not data scarcity. Convergence of data, precision medicine, and smart devices, and artificial intelligence in a way that allows us to understand more about how we're made, how our bodies are functioning day to day, and even give us insight in terms of how we're feeling, where health becomes an everyday, all the time thing. And truly data becomes a reflection of us or our digital twin, and helps us down the path of our health journey. So today, I'm going to turn it back over to our Chief Strategy Officer, Amber Hartley. We have a special guest, Grant Morgan, and Amber's going to introduce Grant. But Amber's going to dive a little deeper into this whole emergent world of edge diagnostics, edge therapeutics, and really edge intelligence.
Thanks, Frank. And thank you to everyone who joined today. We're really excited about the conversation we're going to have today. So as Frank kind of talked about, there's really this convergence of market forces that we're seeing right now. That are really driving technology to move away from these really centralized models and move towards the edge. So you can flip ahead. The first one that we're really seeing is that there is a push towards IoT and smart products that really live at the edge. And what does this really mean? It means that, as Frank said, you have a cell phone in your pocket that is a computing device, a very powerful computing device. We're seeing all sorts of wearables, both health-related wearables and more consumer-related wearables. All of those smart products are really growing in number and their complexity and their ability to do complex computing. That is really running in parallel to this push towards greater consumer ownership of data and consumer privacy of individual data, personal data. What that really means is that as our healthcare really moves into the edge, as people interact with their devices and their smart products, where they live, work, and play, and where they own all of that data and really control all of that data that is so personal to them, all of the computing power and the data management also has to move to the edge. So what we start seeing is that as products become more abundant, personal products, personal computing products, as data privacy moves towards the edge, more towards people, you start seeing these distributed networks that can handle all of that data living at the edge, and edge computing that can really handle how you process and analyze and understand that data living at the edge. And then the extension of that is artificial intelligence. You know, artificial intelligence no longer is limited to this centralized notion of I take all of this data, I aggregate it within a centralized location, and then I run this complex AI on it. Now what we're starting to see is that AI gets pushed out to the edge as well, and that you need to analyze and understand and apply intelligence on top of data as data is living in the edge. What this really sets the stage for is even things like digital twin technologies, where people start to really put their data to work. They can leverage their data with AI to optimize and personalize their own experience. And that really sets the foundation for things like digital twin. So you can click ahead. So what does this mean in healthcare in particular? So how are we starting to see this in healthcare? So what we're starting to see is this big push away from traditional brick and mortar and more towards interacting with people where they live, work, and play, both health and healthcare. And what that means is that diagnostics and care delivery and treatments, all of these things are moving from this model of being prescribed and controlled and administered within a brick and mortar setting to being chosen by individual people, in many cases self-administered or self-prescribed. You know, I can go on my phone and I can download a health-related app, or I can choose to participate in a digital therapeutic that's being offered by a pharmaceutical company of a drug that I'm taking. All of these things really become possible and are really starting to push healthcare towards the edge, towards where people live, work, and play. That trend really kind of started with telemedicine. That was one of the really early kind of technologies that grabbed a foothold and really kind of pulled health and healthcare out of a traditional brick and mortar setting. Obviously, the last year has really pushed telemedicine to the forefront, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. But what we're also starting to see is things like consumer genomic products are becoming much more useful for how people are starting to understand themselves, and they're making that choice. People make that choice, not a doctor making that choice. So the sort of paradigm shift of people having a more proactive and a more controlled way of taking ownership of their health and healthcare, all of these trends are pushing healthcare to the edge. So the other trend that we're seeing is things like concierge health, things like dispatch health. We bring health to you instead of you having to come to the brick and mortar. We're starting to see things like I mentioned digital therapeutics. So pharmaceutical companies are prescribing much more complex therapies. And as part of that, you have to get a deeper understanding of how people are doing on a therapy. You know, some of these therapies are very expensive, very complex to administer. So you really have to understand, if you're going to accept some of the risk of those therapies, you have to understand how people are doing so that you can get them optimal care, so that you can engage with people, get the proper adherence on those medications. All of that happens through companion therapeutics and digital therapeutics, things like symptom trackers, reporting for serious adverse events. All of those things kind of fall within that bucket. And then lastly, what we're really starting to see is the emergence of things like consumer therapeutics and edge therapeutics and diagnostics. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, is how you move from a more traditional approach, a brick and mortar prescribed approach, to a much more consumer-centric, personalized approach to health. Companies that are building these types of solutions are really stepping into this next generation where the person that they're engaging with has direct access and control over their health experience and what they engage with and what apps and solutions and services they want to use. And so in order to do that, you really have to think differently about how you build and deliver and manage these kinds of solutions. So you can click ahead. So what does that mean in terms of where BurstIQ fits in here? So how is BurstIQ involved in this? BurstIQ really provides the framework for how companies building edge diagnostics and treatments are able to move towards this new decentralized model, where both the location of the data and the ownership of the data moves out to the edge, to devices, to people. And what we're starting to see is that Moore's law is really being applied to these. You know, companies like BurstIQ give you this nice packaged up solution that make it really easy and cheap to get to market more quickly. And you can pass that on to consumers, making these products much more accessible to consumers. On top of that, because of how the platform or the network architects data, it allows you to make edge computing, edge analytics, and even edge AI much more accessible. So you can run these very complex processes like AI across thousands or even millions of data of devices and data endpoints without having to aggregate or consolidate all that data. And what does that really kind of mean for companies having to do this? So we know that all of these apps are really growing in number. So we're seeing a doubling of the number of health applications and services, direct to consumer applications and services in the last 6 years. But what BurstIQ does is help you overcome that trust component. So right now we see this very low trust level in these more centralized traditional systems. But if you can actually meet people where they are, allow people to actually control and own and create their own experience, it helps people engage more in a more personalized way, helps you engage with your customers in a personalized way, so that you can actually enhance their experience, but also create a reduced risk, an optimized efficiency, and a better outcome in those products. So fundamentally, what BurstIQ does is provide the tools that allow edge diagnostics and treatments and the providers of these services to create a much more robust, much more person-centric experience at the edge, at where people are, instead of these more traditional approaches. So that actually leads to where we are today. So we've had a collaboration with Flowmetric for a long time now. We began working with our guest, Grant Morgan, and his team about a year ago to create a new model for person-centric products, services, and how we think about the data that's being generated by these solutions. So I'm going to introduce our guest today. I have the pleasure of doing that. Grant Morgan is the Executive Vice President of Flowmetric Life Sciences and the General Manager of VaxEffect, which is a division of Flowmetric. Grant has been in the life sciences industry for over 20 years. He's held operational leadership roles at Allergan, BTG, and others. He's consulted with life sciences clients in both the US and in the UK. Operational implementation with strategic objectives. He's a scientist by training with an undergrad degree in biomedical sciences from the University of Bradford in the UK. Before he decided, very smart choice, to move here to the US, where he received a PhD in microbiology from Ohio State. So Grant, thank you so much for being here. We are thrilled to have you. And I am going to give you the pleasure of starting off by talking a little bit about VaxEffect. So we've talked about kind of edge diagnostics and therapeutics and moving these personalized products from a brick and mortar setting out to where people are, out to where people live their lives. What does that mean for you guys? What is VaxEffect and how is it doing that?
First of all, thanks very much, Amber, for the introduction and inviting me to speak with everyone today alongside BurstIQ, which is turned into a trusted partner for Flowmetric and the VaxEffect division. So if I can expand a little bit on what the VaxEffect platform and test is. So it's a COVID-19 vaccine immune response test, but unlike other serology tests like ELISA or laminar flow, what it does is it simultaneously detects two antibodies to two different parts of the virus, the COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 virus. The first one is the nucleocapsid protein, which is actually on the inside of the virus, so isn't generally exposed to an immune system unless you take the virus in the native state and sort of essentially chew it up, present it, and antibodies are generated. So we detect that antibodies raised against that antigen or protein. The second one is the RBD component of the spike protein. So you've probably all heard about the spike protein. That's actually what has made up all of the US vaccines that are out there today, either through mRNA or in a virus carrying vehicle. It exposes the person to the spike protein, which is on the outside of the virus, and you generate an immune response. So our test also is able to identify the spike protein as well. So that's unlike the ELISA and laminar flow, which typically just detect one antigen and one antibody associated with that antigen. And because of that, and why it's important, is that we are actually able to not only identify if a person's been previously exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but more importantly, and why we developed this specific test built in a flow cytometry platform, is that it's able to uniquely and qualitatively and quantitatively identify how you've responded to the vaccine you received. So the first thing it does is gives a qualitative answer as to whether you've generated an immune response to the vaccine you received. So that is similar to the ELISA and some of the laminar flows that are out there. But what it does and what it separates itself from with the other tests, other serology tests, is that it's actually quantitative over an extremely wide dynamic range, which means that we are able to detect strong responders who've generated a lot of antibodies to the spike protein, and if they've been exposed to the virus, also the nucleocapsid protein. But also people who are weak responders, who in taking other tests may actually be falsely negative in that test. The VAX Effect test, it will give a weak positive immune response detection if there is has been some but few antibodies generated against the vaccine they received. So in that way, the test is highly specific for both vaccine as well as detection of prior exposure, but also can be used for repeat testing so that a person can actually track their response or their immune levels over time to see whether they maintain that effective immune response that they've generated, hopefully in response to the vaccine.
That makes a lot of sense. And I would imagine, I mean, there are so many factors in a person's profile or their kind of health attributes about, you know, what would impact a person's immune response and whether they have a high immune response or a low immune response. So are there other kinds of information that you guys look at or sort of in a research context for what actually would be predictive of a high immune response or a low immune response? And part of the reason I'm asking this is because fundamentally, as we think about, you know, LifeGraphs and the way that LifeGraphs model data, starting to be able to correlate other aspects of a person's health profile between their VaxEffect score and their longitudinal VaxEffect score over time against their genomic profile, against their medical history, against even things like environmental factors. You know, are those kinds of things in the downstream, would they be helpful, or would you be looking at those kinds of correlations?
Well, certainly we'd be very interested to see if there are correlations, and we know for a fact that there are some correlations. One of the correlations that doesn't exist, that people actually think is something you've heard by word of mouth, has been said, depending on which vaccine you get, you'll hear you're getting the Moderna vaccine, or you get a really bad immune response to the vaccine, but that means you're generating a strong immune response. Or if you haven't actually reacted very strong to the vaccine, maybe your arm where you had the vaccine hurts a little bit, but that's it. That's the only symptoms you have. The sort of word of mouth is that you may not have generated a strong immune response. So the first thing we found in testing hundreds of people across all of the vaccines that are currently available in the US is that there is absolutely no correlation whatsoever with the amount of symptoms you have in getting the vaccine to the immune response you generated as measured in the antibodies that you generated against the spike protein. So, and I can speak to that personally. I had no response to the first or the second vaccine I got, to the Moderna vaccine. And I had, as I said, little pain in my arm, and it went away in one night. And yet of the 100 or so people associated with my company, I actually had the highest immune response of anyone in the company. So there's really no correlation. We see people who get super sick, have to take time off work, and their immune response is significantly less than myself or others who had no response. And yet some people who have reacted have also had a very strong response. So there is no correlation there. What we do know, and what you're hearing more and more in the media, is certain kinds of diseases, indications, or treatments will actually affect how you respond to the vaccine. So if you're immunocompromised, either because of an immune disease and you have a suppressed immune system, or perhaps you're taking immunosuppressive agents to actually suppress your immune system, that will sometimes greatly affect your ability to generate an immune response to the vaccine. And so somebody who may be taking an immunocompromising drug or suppressing drug would be, for example, someone who's had an organ transplant. As everyone I'm sure is aware, when you have an organ transplant, your immune system will see that as a foreign entity and will try and reject it. And so that's why people take long-term immunosuppressive drugs to stop that rejection of that new organ. And what we're finding, and what is being published now widely, is that the immune response to the vaccine in those patients is very low or not at all. And that's why our test is actually uniquely important for that group of people, immunocompromised people, because as I mentioned in my first point, a lot of people who have a negative result with some of these other serology tests may think that they haven't generated immune response, and the way the immune system responds or acts in a very high level way is that your first exposure to something will generate a weak immune response and not really that targeted. It's okay. But the second exposure will actually explode that first immune response logarithmically. So it produces a massive boost or increase in antibodies specific to that second exposure. And that's why a lot of vaccines do have the 2 regimen injections. And so if a vaccinated person who is immunocompromised has a weak immune response, even after that second shot, there's a good chance they're coming in with a third and possibly even a fourth under physician guidance and oversight may actually cause that immune response to be significant enough that they are now have a sufficient level to be protected against further exposure to the virus. So that's something that we're looking at and working on and understanding that. And we believe it's really important to link immunocompromised status to understanding whether you've responded to the vaccine. But to your point, Amber, there's probably lots of other genetic makeup markers, environmental stressors that also will have a significant effect on your immune response. As most people know, anytime you're stressed, your immune response is suppressed as a result of that. And so again, that may affect your vaccine immune response. And it's important to know that when you try and return to your normal life, try and return to business as usual. Were you particularly stressed when you got the vaccine? Did you generate that immune response you were hoping for?
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a ton of sense. And actually, I mean, that's sort of a good segue into kind of how you guys are using BurstIQ's technology and the LifeGraph building capabilities of the network. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how you guys are using the LifeGraph network?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is just pure logistics. As you can imagine, there's quite a lot going on with ordering a test, starting off with a kit and then ordering the test. So the test is actually currently available through a physician's office only. And because of that, we're working very closely with physicians. The first thing that has to happen is the physician has to register. We have to show that they are indeed a medical professional. Then they have to order a kit that we're providing for free. The kit contains a blood collection tube, a barcode, and other things for shipping the blood sample back to us. Once they get the kit, they then have to register a patient. They have to submit payment information. The blood sample has to be checked in. The kit has to be correctly sent to the manufacturers of the kit. They have to send back which sample barcodes are being produced and included in the box. Once the blood is collected, it is sent to us. We then make sure we have the right barcode associated with the right patient because of confidentiality, obviously. And then we return the results back to our website for viewing by the patient and the doctor. So as you can imagine, the supply chain and the logistical chain is quite complex. And we use BurstIQ for the entirety of that, the end-to-end monitoring and checking of that. So if there is an issue, all the way from doctor trying to register, to ordering a kit, to doing the blood test, to paying, to shipping the kit from the doctor's office to us, or getting the results back to the VaxEffect portal, we are able to understand where that issue is through the analytics and the back-end programming of the BurstIQ platform. And the second component is, as I mentioned earlier, we really are interested in that longitudinal testing. We think it will be very, very important for people to not only see how have they responded to the vaccine they received when they did that first test, maybe got it 2 weeks after the vaccine or a month after the vaccine, but actually how is that immune response maintained? Does it stay constant for 6 months or so and then starts declining? We've seen in some people, actually, you see a decline within 3 months, and others maintain that immune response over a much longer period of time. So using the blockchain-based LifeGraph provided by BurstIQ, we're actually able to put together those separate tests results that a patient may do over time and produce a longitudinal chart and profile that the patient and their doctor can look at and really understand, is the immune system being maintained to a level that they're comfortable with, or is it declining sufficiently that they may want to think about having that conversation about a booster, or if not available, being a little bit more careful about going to high risk areas, both in the US and potentially internationally, where the vaccination rate may be a little lower and the disease and disease variants are more prevalent. So they've really helped us do that. And then really the other part is the data ownership. It was really important to VaxEffect that the patient owns their own data, that we don't own the data. And so the BurstIQ is in a really strong spot and really are leaders in the space of ownership of data and patient ownership of data. And so we're very excited to work with the patients, work with the doctors and the healthcare providers to provide analytics and outputs, understanding of trends over time in a confidential way, not exposing any patient identifiers, but then actually making the data available to the individuals, because then they own the data, and then we can work with them as to how they would want to utilize the data that they own. Maybe they want to keep it purely private, which is entirely up to them, or maybe they're interested in monetizing it, and that's something that we could help the individuals with through the blockchain and BurstIQ technology.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things I heard you sort of speaking about in there that I think is really awesome is, you have on the one end, you have your supply chain and the chain of custody from the manufacturing of a testing kit to the distribution of that kit to how that kit is actually used and collection of a sample to then processing and delivery of the test result back to the consumer and their doctor. The interesting thing is that you've got that whole process, and then you have a person's downstream profile and the longitudinal test results over time. All of that is one big, it's sort of connected life graph, one big view of all the way from raw materials down through distribution and processing to that person, and then even further down to their clinical outcomes over time. That having that level of visibility in a way that can be trusted by all of the stakeholders who are interacting with various different pieces of that whole end-to-end system, that I think is really, really cool, because, one of the things that we've seen is that there's this huge need for all of these products to be able to trace back through the supply chain, so that, let's say, for example, something happened with one of the kits and you need to issue a recall, you can not just, find sort of what lot was related to it, but you can get to the exact person who received a test from that particular kit with that particular reagent. The level of visibility and traceability in that is just immense. And I think that is a really powerful tool from an operational perspective. The other piece is that it gives that person this trust in the system, that they actually own the data that's coming out of this system, that if they really wanted to, they could trace it all the way back through their entire experience. And then to the point that you made, downstream, what do you want to do with that data? Do you want to keep it private? Do you want to use it to create more personalized experiences for yourself by sharing that with an app or a service that uses it to create personalization? Or do you want to even monetize it or donate it? We definitely get a number of inquiries around, how do I set up data donation programs, for example? All of that sort of becomes the art of the possible when you put data into the hands of people. So I love that. That is just super cool. And so you guys are launching this week, right?
Yeah. Hopefully tomorrow.
Perfect. So then what can people really expect? How are people going to be interacting with their data, both in sort of, this initial launch that you guys are doing, and then even over time, how is this going to evolve, and how are people going to be able to really interact with it?
Yeah, so it's actually going to be really a fun sort of interactive experience, and hopefully will provide information to the patient or the consumer that they wouldn't get anywhere else. So The test itself, actually, because it detects these two antibody levels against these two antigens of the virus, we're able to provide 4 unique pieces of information to someone who takes the test off the bat and longitudinally over time. So the first one is, did I generate an immune response to the vaccine? So that's really straightforward and lets you know, yes or no, did I generate an immune response? But then the next part is it's fully quantitative, as I said, over a dynamic range, which is actually logarithmic in scale. So not 1 to 10, it's actually 1 to millions. And therefore, we've got a really wide dynamic range that we can assess your immune response, because people are varied on the amount of immune response, amount of antibodies they're generating. And the people we've looked at, above 1,000 people we've looked at now, the immune response is really spread out. But as you'd expect, it's forming a bell-shaped curve where the majority of people sit sort of in the middle and have the same sort of levels, but you also get the super responders on one side and then the low responders on the other. So we're able to show that. So we're able to quantitate it. The second thing is that we're able to do it over time. Well, the third thing is we're able to do it over time because it is so quantitative that if you are of a certain level, and we're using a VAX Effect score, so actually we're quantitating your antibody levels into a VAX Effect score. So the average that we're seeing right now is around 15 for a VAX Effect score. It can go anywhere above 30 and all the way down to 1 or 2. The average is about 15 VAX Effect score. But if you measure over time, say every 3 months or every 6 months, you'll be able to see how that VAX Effect score, which is a direct correlation of your antibody levels, changes over time. So there's that longitudinal testing that we just talked about. And then the last piece is we're able to actually identify, separate from a vaccine response, yes or no, if you've actually been previously exposed to the virus. So 40% of people who had exposure to the virus didn't even know that. They had no symptoms or such mild symptoms that they didn't do anything about it. They didn't get tested. And so we're actually able to identify those people who've responded to the virus independent of the vaccine. And we're able to do that because of that second nuclear capsid antigen, which is usually inside the virus. But when you are exposed, you chew up the virus, you generate antibodies. And so we're able to detect that. And so that's that fourth piece of information. So with that piece of information, we're able to present that back to the patient and the physician in a really easy to understand graphical output. So we're able to say yes or no, did you respond to your vaccine? Did you have prior exposure to a virus? How strong was your immune response in a VAX Effect score? And we're able to actually take your VAX Effect score and put it on a bell-shaped curve, a histogram, against everyone else who's taken the test. So you can see, maybe you're on the low side of 15, but you're still within the bell-shaped curve. You're still within the normal range. And so you can feel pretty good about that. You may be a super responder. You may be someone who's got a little bit of a lower immune response, a little bit on the tail end of the bell-shaped curve. And maybe that's something that may trigger a conversation with your healthcare provider. So that's something we're really excited about. And then the longitudinal testing, there will be longitudinal graphs, as we talked about, where you'll be able to see how your immune response has changed over time in comparison to a standardized version of everybody else's who've done a longitudinal test. So you'll be able to see whether your immune response has declined at the same sort of rate as everybody else, or maybe it's staying more constant than the average person, or declining quicker than most people. Again, maybe triggering a conversation with your healthcare provider. So the implications over time is a great one. And one of the things that we're really excited about is something called the correlate of protection. And that's in the media quite a lot now. People will ask us, well, am I protected? If I get my VAX Effect score and it says 15, does that mean I'm protected? Well, right now, no one can tell you what that level is that provides protection from virus exposure and not being effective, not getting the symptoms. But people are working on that, and they are actually testing thousands of people, their antibody responses, and then when they've been exposed to the virus subsequently, so they've had the vaccine, they've generated immune response, they're then exposed to the virus, and then they're testing what their antibody levels are, and they're trying to find what that correlate of protection is. So what is that level of antibody that protects you from the virus? And because our test is the most quantitative test on the market, our test is ideal for measuring that correlate of protection and then doing it against our antibody levels that we're able to detect. So in the long term, we really hope to work with government officials, healthcare providers to actually assess and identify that correlate of protection for individuals. And so when their immune response does start going below that correlate of protection, then that's a positive indicator that they need to react to that. And then the other component that we're looking at and hearing about is booster shots. So a lot of government officials, CDC, healthcare providers are talking about when is the right time to give a booster. Which booster should a person receive? Should it just be the J&J single shot? Should it be another version of the Moderna shot? Should it be a combination of different vaccines combined? And so again, with our test and that longitudinal readout, we'll be able to give advice, real definitive objective data as to whether that booster shot makes sense for an individual.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And so that's actually sort of a good lead in, like, what's next for you guys? What's next for the VaxEffect platform? Obviously you guys have, you're launching this first version of it and looking at partnerships. Where are you guys sort of going to take this in the next, 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, so, and you've heard me refer to it as a platform, and it is indeed a VaxEffect platform where it can actually be used and adjusted to implement new tests against other vaccines. So COVID-19 is the first test that we have, and we'll be launching officially tomorrow. You'll be able to go onto VaxEffect.com and through your healthcare provider, order a kit and then take the test, and we can tell you a VaxEffect score and you can start tracking longitudinally. But, COVID hopefully will actually go away, though it's looking less and less likely as the variants come up, and it may be a cyclical thing. But we're also interested in other vaccines where people really do want to know about their immune response to it. So some of the things, some of the vaccines that are out there that are really do lend themselves very well to the VaxEffect platform are things like the HPV vaccine, which is given typically to children in the 11 to 12 age group. But most children aren't sexually active till high school, college, or even later. And so when you're giving a vaccine at 11 or 12, obviously over time, that vaccine immune response may decline. And so it would be useful for a parent to know that their child still has maintained a strong immune response to the HPV vaccine, because as everyone knows, HPV can cause cancer and can be transmitted to other partners. So it would be useful to the individual and their parents as to whether they are still protected. The second one that we're also thinking about is meningitis. So students are encouraged to take the meningitis vaccine before they go to college. It's not required. But we strongly believe, and I think a lot of parents do, that it makes a lot of sense to be vaccinated with the meningitis vaccine before their children go off to college, because it's highly infectious. And if there is an outbreak in universities, you hear about it sometimes, it's extremely contagious and also very severe and actually it can be deadly. So it's important to get that meningitis vaccine, but you also want to know that your child's maintaining that immune response when they first get it and over the life of their college interactions with other people. So again, that's another good one. And the third one we're thinking about, though again, we're not limiting ourselves, is the shingles vaccine. People typically are encouraged to take in their 50s, but what does it look like when you're in your 70s, your 80s, your 90s? People are living older and older ages now, which is great, but there can be reemergence of the virus that causes shingles in the 80s, in the 90s. So if your vaccine you receive in your 50s is waning 30 years later, it'd be good to know that, because then you could talk to your healthcare provider about a booster. So we're going to start with the COVID-19 vaccine and the VaxEffect score to measure your immune response, but we'll be expanding the platform to lots of other vaccines where people are interested to know their immune response.
That's great. That really kind of creates this whole family of connected applications and services and the data that's associated with them, so that you really are starting to kind of build this deep understanding of how people interact with disease processes and with the vaccines that they get. Really starts to build the intelligence of understanding the health process and the immune process over time across all of these conditions. So that's really, really cool. I want to sort of switch gears for the last kind of a couple of questions, which, we talked at the beginning about edge diagnostics, edge treatments, and a lot of these solutions really kind of moving into the hands of people and people taking greater control over their health experience and the data associated with their health experience. You guys are obviously living and breathing this on a daily basis as you launch this VaX Effect line of products. So I'm curious from your perspective, how can companies start to plan for this future? What does it look like as a company that is really delivering health on the edge? What is the impact, and how is this approach really kind of impacting both the industry, and also how do companies start planning for this? What kind of insights would you give for companies that are developing these kinds of products for how they need to adapt and change their business?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think really what companies must understand and what questions they need to go about and look at is the questions and the concerns consumers have. What is it that consumers worry about? What is it patients worry about? Not just the patients. Where are the gaps and the support that their healthcare providers aren't able to give? Where's the gaps that a doctor says, well, you've asked me this question, how can I do this? Or how can I measure that? How can I do this? And the physician says, right now, I can't tell you that answer. And I'll give you a really good example of that. The VaxEffect platform was started principally because the CEO of the company, when he was younger and his children were getting shots as young children, and he would ask the doctor, how do we measure the immune response? Did they actually react to the vaccine? What's their titers? He's a scientist by training, and he was asking about titers of antibodies, and they weren't able to tell him. So here's a piece of information, and it's stuck in his mind, and the opportunity to develop the VaxEffect test, that's what triggered it. So, it was that question that he had. So companies must be really willing to look outside and ask questions of both consumers and healthcare providers. What's not being met? What's the unmet need right now? And then the second part is, and everyone's seeing this, that treatment for diseases is ongoing, that everyone's, companies coming up with further treatments for diseases, better treatments. But we're also looking more at preventing disease. So disease prevention, getting to that progression from a healthy cell to a diseased cell, interacting with that flow of disease in a much earlier stage. So you're actually preventing progression to a disease and then treating the disease. It's much better, much more cost effective to treat and prevent a cell or an organ or a system moving to the disease state. So companies should be looking further down the chain of disease to actually preventing that last stage of going to disease, and looking for tests, diagnostics, palliative or preventive medicines that actually stop people transitioning to that point where they have a disease, and actually now the treatment is much more expensive, much more impactful, more side effects, and more of a burden on the healthcare industry. So that's what we're looking at, and I think this is what we would encourage other companies to do who are moving into this space, which is looking at the earliest part of that disease progression and thinking about people's wellness, people's health awareness, and really helping them understand where they are, and helping the physicians understand and measure where they are, and so potentially pick up before it goes to a point of disease, picking up those indicators of potential disease progression and running those tests, and then providing support to stop that final progression.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you really touched on a couple of things that I think are really critical in terms of, being able to build a longitudinal profile of a person and a person's journey is really critical to being able to do that. That is really how you get to the level of insight that allows you to predict the progression from a pre-disease state into a disease state. And then even on top of that, once you have that longitudinal profile, being able to apply AI and predictive models on top of that so that you can start to get a better understanding and capture those cases earlier in that pre-disease process, to your point, so that you can reduce those costs much earlier in the process. I think that all of that, I think you're 100% right. That really is, sort of the secret sauce that we're all trying to get to. So I want to pause here and pass it back to Frank. I have not been able to see the chat while I'm speaking. So Frank, I don't know if there are questions from the audience or you have some follow-up questions, but I want to open it up.
Well, I had a list, but I think you guys are doing a great job addressing the kinds of things that we're going to ask, particularly, what's next? What's next beyond COVID? So I think that's such an important aspect. Flowmetric itself as a company isn't a household name, but the pharmaceutical industry has known Flowmetric for quite some time as the leader in flow cytometry. And to put it all in perspective, we've seen this consumer push on the genomic side in terms of people able to take genomic tests and maybe understand their ancestries and kind of beyond their propensity for certain disease. We're starting to see the emergence of proteomics, which are measuring proteins and how your body's functioning. But I think there's such a powerful future in flow cytometry where we've taken this technology that's been limited to big pharma and now moving it out to the edge in terms of really speeding up vaccine development and measuring vaccine efficacy and just a wide range of extensions because it's dealing with cellular biology, which is our fundamental makeup. And Grant, just kudos to you and your team in terms of really leaning forward and taking what has traditionally been a back-end lab science and making it available to everybody who really needs it through their physician or who's really interested in their ongoing health. And I hope soon that you're able to get through some of the regulatory issues and make it just generally available to everybody and keep pushing that intelligence out to the edge. And I just want to say thank you for you and your team for all this leading edge work that you've undertaking and really stepping out for the benefit of everybody, helping to make a world a healthier place.
And thank you to you guys as well. I appreciate your words, and I want to pass that back and say, BurstIQ, great partnership, and looking forward to continuing and expanding into these other vaccine areas, other tests, as you mentioned. Flow cytometry as a platform is uniquely positioned to be able to actually bring diagnostics to people that really don't exist right now. And so the partnership, is important to us, and as we move forward. So thank you.
Yeah. And I think we've only begun to see it apply to other dimensions, not just vaccine efficacy, but how it can impact infectious disease in general and cancer biology and virology and all the things you were talking about in disease prevention. It's such a cool thing to begin to understand and making it understandable, for people like us is a huge step in this being part of my everyday health. So thanks again.
No, thank you.
And thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate your time spending with us on this round of our Knowledge Burst, and look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.